All right, guys, it's Miss Johnson here again, and we are back to pick up the second half of our Unit 5 Notes 3 video. We're talking about the quadratic formula today, and we left off on number 3 on your notes page. So it's the back of the first side of your notes page. So now I am looking at the equation 4x squared plus 2x is equal to 17. One of the notes that you made in the very front was that these equations need to be set equal to 0 in order to solve them. So when I look at this equation, I'm going to move this negative or move this 17 over to the other side of my equal sign, and I cancel that by making it negative. So subtracting 17. I don't ever really want to move the squared term. I always want to leave the squared term where it is, so I always move everything to the squared term if I need to. And then that thing is equal to 0, and now I can go ahead and solve. So I have x is equal to, oh, here's my a and b and c. Should make note of those. There's a, there's b, c is negative 17. So x is equal to opposite of b, that's negative 2, plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is negative 17. And that's all divided by 2 times a, which is 4. Notice again that my fraction bar is all the way across, even under the opposite b that's out front. Okay, simplify the radical first. You have to start underneath the radical. That's what order of operations tells us. The radical sign, or the square root symbol, that really is a grouping symbol. It's like parentheses or brackets. I have to make sure I take care of underneath that first. So underneath there, 2 squared is 4. We know that. Then type this into your calculator. Negative 4 times negative 17, and I end up with 272 there. Because it's a negative times a negative, it's now plus, or positive, 272. In the denominator, we all know that 2 times 4 gives me 8. All right, keep going. I have negative 2 out front, still haven't done anything with it. Underneath the radical, 4 and 272 is 276. 76, all divided by 8. Take the square root of 276. When I take the square root of 276, this is not a perfect square. So I need to round this one to a couple decimal places. So when I type this into my calculator, so I have negative 2 plus or minus, I'm going to round it to 16.61 and go from there. Notice, by the way, I still haven't done anything with the denominator of 8. So now I'm to the point where I'm ready to split this off. I need to make this 2 separate equations. So I'm going to split 1 into x equals 2, oops, sorry, negative 2 plus 16.61 all over 8, and x equals negative 2 minus 16.61 all over 8. Some more space there. If you just straight type this into your calculator and you don't group the top things together, you're going to get a wrong answer here. Your calculator is going to do 16.61 divided by 8 first and then add the negative 2. That's not what you want. You need to do this part first, or at the very least put the top in parentheses. So negative 2 plus 16.61 is 14.41 divided by 8. And 14.41 divided by 8 was 1.83 there. So notice that the very last thing that I do is divide. That's the very last part of the quadratic formula. So dividing by the denominator is the very last thing. Over on the right-hand side, I have negative 2 minus 16.61. That's a negative 18.61. And then divided by 8. And when I take negative 18.61 divided by 8, I get negative 2.33. So when I write out my solutions, that looks like x equals negative 2.33 and 1.83. These aren't ordered pairs. Sometimes we were finding solutions that were ordered pairs, like way back in the systems unit. These are just 2 different solutions to the quadratic, so they're both x. You can just put a comma between them to signify that. Okay, let's take a look at number 4. X squared minus 2x equals 25. So again, the first thing that I need to make sure that I do is set that equation equal to 0. I don't ever want to move the x squared term. I want the x squared term to stay where it is. So I'm going to subtract the 25 to move that over. End up with x squared. Oh, that's hard to see. X squared minus 2x minus 25 is equal to 0. So that tells me that my A is equal to 1, B is equal to -2, C is equal to -25, and I can substitute and solve from there. So I have x is equal to opposite of B. So B is -2, I'm going to make that +2. Plus or minus the square root of B squared, put it in parentheses, minus 4 times A times C, put those all in parentheses. I just always do. It eliminates the chance for error. So over 2a, which is 2 times 1, and then go to work. Under the radical first, square root of -2 squared is +4. Again, put it in parentheses when you plug that into your calculator. Otherwise, you're going to get something wrong. Then -4 times 1 times -25 is going to give me 100. That's +100 because a negative times a negative is positive. Denominator we can take care of. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 plus or minus 104 all over 2. And 104 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to have to do some rounding here. When I take the square root of 104, I get 10.2. So x is equal to 2 plus or minus 10.2 all over 2. Again, notice that once I take that square root of 104, I don't have a radical symbol anymore. No more radical. It's all done. And now I'm ready to the point that I can split. So I have x equals 2 plus 10.2 over 2 and 2 minus 10.2 over 2. The 2 plus 10.2 over 2 is 12.2 over 2. And 12.2 divided by 2 gives me 6.1. Not 61, 6.1, sorry. And then 2 minus 10.2 is -8.2 divided by 2, -4.1. So my solutions are -4.1 and 6.1. All right, number 5, let's take a look. In number 5, I have 0 is equal to -2x minus 3 minus 4x squared. When I take a look at this equation, one, I notice that it said equal to 0, so that's good. That's a start. But I also notice that my terms are a little out of order here. They're not really in standard form. Technically, this is my B term, that's my C term, and that's my A term, because I need to take a look at what it's with. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite those so that they are in standard form. The 4x squared is negative, so -4x squared, and actually in this one all of my terms are negative, -2x minus 3. All right, so that means my A is -4, my B is -2, and my C is -3. Now I'm going to plug it in. I have x is equal to, opposite of b, +2, plus or minus square root of b, -2 squared, minus 4 times -4 times -3, all over 2 times -4. Simplify under the radical. +2 plus or minus. -2 squared is +4. -4 times -4 times -3 is -48. A negative times a negative times a negative again is still negative. And then bottom, 2 times -4 is -8. That's fine. All right, so simplify that radical even further. 4 minus 48 is -44. We talked about this in the last video. That negative underneath the radical, that should be a red flag for you. Uh-oh. I have a negative under the radical. So when I type that into my calculator tells me some sort of domain error or cannot divide by 0 or syntax error. There's some, whatever error it tells you, that's not a coincidence. That's not an accident. That's actually true. That's because there is no solution here. All right. Last one of the quadratic formula, and we're going to look at a couple of application questions using the quadratic formula. Number 6, I have negative 8x squared, or f of x. There's that function notation again, in case you forgot. Function notation. It's just a different way of saying y equals. So I have negative 8x squared plus 10x. No constant in this question. There's nothing else after the 10x. So that means my constant is 0. So a is negative 8. B equals 10, and C equals 0. And we'll take a look at what that does to our quadratic formula. So now when I set up the quadratic formula, it looks like this. I have x is equal to the opposite of 10, so negative 10 plus or minus square root of, that's 10 squared minus 4 times negative 8 times 0 all over 2 times negative 8. Simplify under the radical, so negative 10 plus or minus, leaving that the same. 10 squared is 100. And then negative 4 times negative 8 times 0, that's just 0. I end up with plus 0 there. Negative 16 on the bottom. And we all know that adding 0 doesn't make a difference. So this is really just the square root of 100. It's supposed to be a minus sign there. Negative 16 on the bottom. Square root of 100 is 10. So negative 10 plus or minus 10 over the negative 16. All right, so now we're ready to split. Once you get to the point that you've taken the radical of the top, you're ready to split it off. So I have negative 10 plus 10 over negative 16 and negative 10 minus 10 over 16. Oops, negative 16, sorry. Negative 10 plus 10, that's 0. 0 over negative 16 is still 0. Negative 10 minus 10 is negative 20. Negative 20 divided by negative 16. You can divide both of those by 4, and you get positive, because negative divided by negative, 5/4. So those are my two solutions there. And it is possible to have 0 as a solution. It can cross the x-axis at the point 0. So 5/4 and 0. I guess I should have put them in the other order, but it doesn't matter. It means the same thing. Okay, let's flip over to the last page and look at our couple application questions, and then we'll be all set for notes 3. Number 7, the power tower ride at Valley Fair takes riders to the top of the tower and drops them 60 feet at speeds reaching 80 feet per second. The function that models this ride is h equals negative 16t squared plus 80t plus 60, where h is the height in feet and t is the time in seconds. About how many seconds does it take for the riders to drop from 60 feet to 0 feet? Okay, so you're given a whole bunch of information in this question, and you're asked how many seconds, that's your t, does it take for the riders to drop from 60 feet to 0 feet, or in other words, to the ground. You're also told that h is height and that t is time. Okay, and then the other thing is you're given an equation. So you're given the information that went into the equation. That 60 feet per second went right there as our C value because that's where it starts. The 80 feet per second, or 60 feet, sorry, 60 feet, plain old 60 feet, that's where the power tower stops or starts. And then 80 feet per second is in the equation already. A lot of times I see students that want to take the 60 and the 80 and the information that was given to them and try to plug it in here somehow. You don't need to plug it in. You're given an equation, use the equation that you have. So negative 16t squared plus 80t plus 60, that's the equation that I'm using. Now I want to know when this thing is going to hit the ground, which means that's my h. So my h is going to be 0. And then I need to solve this. So again, your three options for solving are graphing, factoring, and quadratic formula. Now, this looks like kind of an ugly thing to graph. You've got some big numbers to deal with, and you'd have to make a rather big coordinate plane. You could probably try to factor it, but again, you're going to get some pretty big numbers to deal with. So I think the easiest way is just to use the quadratic formula. So that's your A, that's your B, that's your C, and plug it in. X equals negative 80 plus or minus square root of 80 squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. And then I go through the steps just like I did on all the previous questions. So I need to simplify under the radical first. Negative 80 plus or minus 80 squared gives me positive 6,400. And then negative 4 times negative 16 times positive 60 is positive 3,800. All over 2 times negative 16, which is negative 32. Keep going. 6,438. Oh, sorry, this is 3,840. Sorry, my fault. 3,840, not 3,800. 6,400 plus 3,840 gives me 10,240. Still over the negative 32. Fraction bar is still all the way over to underneath the opposite of b that's outside the radical. And then take the square root of that 10,240, and I got 101.2 all over negative 32. So now you're ready to split. Once you take that radical, you're ready to split. So here is my plus or minus. I'm going to split it into two pieces. That's negative 8 plus 101.2 over negative 32, and negative 8 minus 101.2 over negative 32. When I plug those two in, I end up getting here negative 8 plus 101.2 is, oh, this is, oh my goodness, 80. Sorry. Hello, 80. Right? Isn't it the opposite of 80? Yeah, opposite of 80. Sorry. So negative 80 plus 101.2 is 21.2 over negative 32. And that gives me negative 0.66. Over here, negative 80 minus 101.2 is negative 181.2 over negative 32. And that gives me 5.66. So I have two possible answers. Like normal, I usually have two possible answers in a parabola. But in this situation, our parabola is actually talking about a real world example. And we're talking about time in seconds. I want this to be a time. I can't have a negative 0.66 seconds. So this whole answer for me is out. That doesn't count because I can't have a negative time. So my only answer here is the positive version, which is 5.66. Oh my goodness, my pen. Seconds. Let's see if it's better up here. 6 seconds. Okay. All right. Last question. Number 8. It says a stunt person attached to a safety harness drops from a height of 210 feet. A function that models the drop is given right there. Negative 16t squared plus 210, where h is the height in feet and t is time in seconds. About how many seconds does it take to drop from 210 to 30 feet? Okay, so 30 is what you're trying to find. That's your height. That's what's going to get plugged in right there. So if I look at the equation that I'm given, I'm going to plug the 30 in. I have 30 equals negative 16t squared plus 210. All right, so now I need to go ahead and solve this. So first thing I recognize is that this is not set equal to 0. So I need to subtract the 30 so that I can make it set equal to 0. So that's negative 16t squared, and then 210 minus 30 is 180. These are constants together, so I put them together. So now I need to identify my A, my B, and my C. Remember that your standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. So my a term here is negative 16. My b term is not there. There is no t in the middle. So that means that b is equal to 0. And then my C term is the 180. So be very careful with that. A lot of people just automatically want to make the second one the B term, but that 180 doesn't have a T with it. It doesn't have a variable. So that's actually my constant, which is the C at the end. Now I'm going to go ahead and plug this into the quadratic formula. So I have T is equal to opposite of B, that's 0, plus or minus the square root of B squared, 0 squared, minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. So T is equal to 0 plus or minus square root of 0 squared is still 0. Negative 4 times negative 16 times 180. Oh, whoops, I forgot to close that parenthesis. That gives me a big number. I get 11,520 for that when I type that into my calculator. All over the negative 32, I can go ahead and put those together. And then adding 0 is not going to make any difference. 0 plus or minus square root of 11,520 all over negative 32. So now take the square root of 11,520 and I get 107.33 roughly. So I'm going to come over here. T is equal to 0 plus or minus 107.33 all over negative 32. So now I'm ready to split it off into two things. I have 0 plus 107.33 over negative 32, and I have 0 minus 107.33 over negative 32. So I want you to think about that logically for a second. If I take 0 and add 107, and I take 0 and subtract 107, I am ending up with a positive 107 and a negative 107. So I get positive 107.33 over negative 32, and I get negative 107.33 over negative 32. So when you divide those, when you do the division, which is always the very last thing that we have to do, I take the 107.33 and divide it by negative 32, and I end up with negative, in this case on the left, negative 3.35. Over here, I would have positive 107.33 over 32, negative 32. Hello, negative 107.33 over negative 32. Sorry, that's a lot to say. That gives me a positive answer. So again, two possible answers, but I'm talking about time. I can't have a negative time, so this whole thing is out. This has to be my only answer, 3.35 seconds. Okay, goodness. Well, that takes us to the end of Unit 5, Notes 3. Thanks so much for listening. Quadratic formula, this is a big piece of algebra, so glad we took some time to talk about it. Come see Ms. Johnson if you have questions, and I will see you later.